Digital Foundry is sponsored by the powerful, upgradable MSI MPG Infinite X2 desktop PC featuring Intel Core processors and NVIDIA RTX 40 series graphics.
The Grand Theft Auto Definitive Edition remasters were highly controversial. These Unreal Engine 4-powered game updates modernized the three classic PS2-era GTA games, GTA 3, Vice City, and San Andreas, with much more advanced rendering technology. At the same time, the reworked lighting was very different from the original titles, and the updated assets didn't hold up to close scrutiny. Some 2 years later, these titles have been released for mobile devices, with versions for iPhone, iPad, and Android. These promise the same updated graphics, but come paired with considerable lighting improvements. So how do modern iPhone and iPad devices cope with these divisive remasters? And do the new lighting effects rehabilitate their visual designs? The GTA Definitive Edition titles adopted a very different visual tone from the original games. San Andreas was the most severely affected, lacking the sepia-toned haze that defined the original release. GTA 3 lost its blue and green tint, and Vice City had a pretty neutral look. Basically, all three titles looked a little bit bland, measured up against their PS2 forebears, which had distinctive visual styles. Looking at the iOS version of the game, running here on an iPhone 15 Pro, it's clear that the lighting has been dramatically overhauled. San Andreas is the most obvious place to start. Just look at the bold, yellow-orange color tone in this scene. Also note the lens flare when the camera faces the sun, and the prominent smog as the camera shifts to another angle. During gameplay, distant detail is occluded somewhat by a sort of bluish distance fog, giving the game a hazy and slightly oppressive feel. If we go back to PS2, here represented fairly faithfully but in high-resolution form in the PS2 Classics emulation on PS4, we tend to see very similar looking effects. This kind of fog effect served a dual purpose, obscuring pop-in on the relatively weak PS2 hardware, and providing a sense of atmospheric scattering, so its replication on iPhone doesn't need to occlude as much distant detail. As the day fades away, this effect takes on a hazy orange look, as the sun's rays travel through a thicker layer of atmosphere. The same is true in GTA 3. The original Definitive Edition remasters present 3 with a clean, sort of sterile tone, while the new iPhone versions give it an obvious blue-green tint. The sky also has a very different appearance here. If we circle back to the original title, we see similar artistic flourishes, which helped define the look of this early PS2 classic. Vice City probably fared best of the definitive editions, with an overall visual appearance that didn't feel too far from the original game. Even still, there are some changes, like how the sun takes on a vibrant, overwhelming look at sunrise. It does vary a little from the original, but I think it gives the game that sun-baked Miami look that the original title tried to achieve. The revised lighting also significantly affects the color of the water across all three games. The base watercolor tends to appear darker across a range of lighting conditions, which lends the water a slightly more realistic appearance, I'd say. The opacity and use of reflections in the water do seem very similar though. I've been showing off the iOS version of the game max settings here with the classic lighting option enabled, but we can turn off classic lighting if we so please. Here, we get a lighting presentation that is quite similar to the earlier Definitive Edition releases. It's not exactly the same, but it does resemble those releases more closely, if you'd prefer a more neutral lighting style. Overall, I think the updated classic lighting is a big improvement over the earlier Definitive Edition releases, and it resolves one of my major contentions with those games. The revised lighting clearly takes a lot of inspiration from the original titles, and in doing so, brings these new releases stylistically much closer to those games. But of course, there are a variety of settings tweaks and adjustments beyond the broader lighting changes. Relative to the 1S, we're mostly looking at cutbacks here. Texture filtering, for instance, operates at a much lower level of fidelity. The alpha textured grass is reduced in volume or absent across these games as well. The cube map based interior maps of indoor environments are gone. Speaking of cube maps, the real-time cube map reflections on the player car are also absent here, though the game's screen space reflections remain to fill in some of the reflection detail. And there are plenty of smaller tweaks to lighting. The games have simpler ambient occlusion now, looking like more of an outline shader than the relatively sophisticated, if strong, ambient occlusion we saw in the earlier versions. The bloom lighting on the neon signage in Vice City is gone, as well as the volumetric lighting. Shadow draw is pulled in massively, with some objects casting shadows only a handful of meters from the player. Car headlights also no longer cast shadows from the player. Curiously though, the resolution of the shadow maps that are drawn is much higher, displaying nicely refined detail relative to the earlier Definitive Edition release. And the shadows move continuously, not in brief chunks every so often. On a small iPhone screen, these changes aren't likely to be particularly bothersome, but they are worth noting. You're still basically getting the Definitive Edition upgrades, just with some smaller concessions with respect to some of the more expensive visual elements. And of course, with overhauled and largely improved lighting. Resolution-wise, on my iPhone 15 Pro here, I got results around 600p with the game set to the highest points on their resolution sliders, which is possibly half res or about 590p. At their lowest points, the games render at about 240p. This is up against the roughly 792p image on Xbox One. Annoyingly, every time you close and reopen the apps, the resolution is reset to the middle of the slider. The games definitely have a soft look when blown up at 4K like I'm doing here, but on the actual device screen of something like an iPhone, I think they look perfectly fine. The game is normally presented in an ultra-widescreen format, but cutscenes are letterboxed down to 16:9. Interestingly, it doesn't look like these titles are using the Metal FX temporal or spatial upscalers here. The imagery looks about as soft and low detail as the internal resolutions would suggest, and I'm not seeing the kinds of artifacts that tend to be characteristic of these techniques. It looks like a pretty standard TAA treatment. On iPhones and iPads, adding the Metal FX temporal upscaler would be cool, at least as an option, as I think it could achieve a sharper image with less artifacting than what we're seeing here. It's nice to see that these games' lighting has been improved, but the Definitive Edition still have substantial issues. Bringing PS2 era titles to PS4 era standards required the replacement or enhancement of virtually all game assets, which came with a variety of problems. The characters are probably the most infamous example. They sport a lot of extra geometry, including fully modeled fingers and more detailed faces, but the animation data remains largely the same as the original titles, so they look awkward in motion, and the PBR materials treatment on them makes them look like they're made out of clay. Making these models look suitably detailed and natural was always going to take an immense amount of work, so I don't blame the developers for achieving substandard results at all, but the final outcome isn't very good. Textures are the other sore spot. The brand new texture art that is here mostly holds up okay, but looks awkward plastered over some of the flat building faces in these games, which generally speaking have unchanged geometry from their PS2 predecessors. Some of the materials have a slightly awkward specular response too, but the most obvious issues, and the object of much player ire, comes from the AI upscaled artwork that is used heavily throughout these games. As a technique, I think AI upscaling can be a very useful tool to achieve good-looking texture art, especially when remastering an older title. The problem is that the texture art in the original game wasn't high enough quality to work effectively with these AI upscalers. To be fair, a lot of the original art, particularly signage, has been fully redrawn. This came with its own issues though, as many of the signs contained spelling errors. Most of these have been fixed, but some remain. Note how gearboxes becomes bearboxes here, for instance, or how accessories is misspelled here. As far as I can tell, there have been no improvements to basic asset quality since the 1.04 patch I looked at in May of 2022, so all of the findings from that video still apply here. The iOS port, perhaps unsurprisingly, seems to be based on that patch or a more recent one, given the revised artwork and the presence of certain effects like the smog textures in San Andreas. But we haven't seen any obvious additional art changes on top of that patch, and there are some obvious areas for improvement. Performance in these new titles is okay by the standards set by the prior Definitive Edition releases, but it could be better. All games are limited to 30 FPS, but exhibit some pretty nasty frame pacing problems, both on the device and when output to an external display. We see a mix of frame times, mostly a pattern of 16 and 33 millisecond frames, with occasional dips to 50 milliseconds and below, and some larger stutters in some moments as well. Dropping the settings to their lowest values doesn't seem to help at all, unfortunately. On my iPhone, I couldn't really do anything that would hit the frame rate significantly. Even driving around in a tank and causing mayhem left me with the same general frame time readout that I saw when driving around in an old vehicle. All the games perform just about identically here as far as I can tell. Motion blur is retained, which makes the frame time variance a little less noticeable, though it can't be turned off, unlike the other console versions. Unfortunately, the story is similar in the older Definitive Edition versions, which also suffered from frame time inconsistencies when capped to 30 FPS. This is an issue that was present in these titles at launch 2 years ago, and it's very disappointing that it hasn't been resolved. On a 4th gen iPad Air, the weakest Apple device that still has USB-C video output with the older A14 chip, performance takes a big hit. Driving around in a car is fine, with the same inconsistent frame pacing we see on the new iPhone. But once we cause some mayhem in a tank, performance takes a nosedive. The game's lighting is stripped back as well, and there's no TAA. I encountered some pretty bad issues with asset loading at times, and I saw one crash over my brief time playing. I don't think these titles scale very well at all to less powerful Apple hardware. There are some issues with compatibility as well. There's no support for PlayStation button icons for those using DualSense controllers, and there's no rumble support on Xbox Series controllers or DualSense. These are common issues in iPhone games, but given their console heritage, these games really should have had more comprehensive controller support. Loading times are the one really compelling performance bright spot. Typical loading times clock in at about 2 seconds or so, a lightning quick pace. Even though these are PS2 games at their core, these titles have some fairly heavy revised assets, and the iPhone loading times are quite impressive. The new Definitive Edition releases on iOS are a mixed bag. They feature a greatly improved lighting presentation relative to the other DE releases, with much closer fidelity to the original PS2 games, and the visual cutbacks are reasonable and not especially noticeable on a smaller mobile device. But performance is unfortunately just not good enough, with highly unstable frame delivery despite their 30 FPS caps. If you're interested in playing these games on the go, I think this collection probably offers the best portable experience at the moment, however. The other alternative on iOS would be the original GTA Trilogy ports, released about a decade ago and updated periodically since. These offer high-resolution rendering, but suffer from similar performance issues at times, don't have all the effects from the PS2 originals, and can feel a little uncomfortable to control given the lack of proper right-stick camera control in GTA 3 and Vice City. The other upside of this collection is that it's available without additional cost, as long as you have a Netflix subscription. The games can also be bought separately, but for many people these titles will essentially come for free. So in a lot of ways, these new definitive editions are a success, translating 8th gen console code to run effectively on mobile devices. It's just that their frame time issues can be distracting, making the games feel somewhat unstable. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. Check out the Patreon at digitalfoundry.net for exclusive and early access content. And to get in touch, use social media. Thanks for watching.
MSI's MPG Infinite X2 PC features powerful Intel Core processors, the latest RTX 40 series graphics, and supports DDR5 memory up to 128GB, with advanced CPU cooling via MSI's own 240mm all-in-one cooler and system thermals handled by the Silent Storm Cooling 2 solution. Every major component in the system is upgradable with a toolless design for easy access. A tempered side panel and MSI Mystic Light RGB adds to the aesthetic, and the latest Wi-Fi 6E networking is supported. Check the link in the video description for full details on the MSI MPG Infinite X2, the all-new MSI gaming desktop.